Hi everybody, Chris Pies here with another PCA Sim Racing Classroom. This week we're going to be tackling Brands Hatch in a all new condition for us here at PCA Racing, and as far as series racing goes, wet conditions. Race 2 for this series will be extremely wet, or well, maybe not extremely wet, but it will be raining, as you can see. So with rain comes some new challenges and some new thoughts that we need to think about when traversing the track. Hope to go through this with you to make it so it's easier to navigate these waters at Brands Hatch, and also hopefully keep you out of trouble and ultimately finish strong. Now, as you can tell, this is a recording and there is no live classroom this week. That is because I am traveling for work, unfortunately. So this is going to be via video on my YouTube page, and I will post the link, or if you're already watching this, the link has been posted. And feel free to come back and refer to this video as much as you'd like. So racing in the rain, what does that mean? What do we do? How do we predict it? Well, with rain racing, the biggest thing is probably the most obvious is there is just an overall lower amount of grip around the track. This grip level is also exacerbated by the types of tires we use in order to get around the track in wet conditions with wet tires. There's not as much rubber contacting the surface as a slick tire would be in dry conditions. The reason we run on wet tires is because wet tires are much more like street tires. They are grooved. They have areas within the tire that allow water to be channeled out of the way of the contacting surfaces of the tire with the tarmac. When it rains, the layer of water sits on top of the track. That layer of water can prevent slick tires from touching the actual surface, and that's what we get or what we call hydroplaning when you're driving in a wet condition, and the tire is actually not touching the surface of the road. Instead, it is on top of a layer of water, and with that you have no control. Tires only work when they're touching the road. The compound and the rubber in the tire must contact the surface. If you were to look microscopically, very zoomed in at like a cross section of a surface of a road, it is not perfectly flat. It has a lot of valleys and crests through it, so it's very jagged. Those jagged peaks and valleys are what rubber from a tire pushes into to give you grip when driving around the track. That, along with the molecular bonding of the rubber and the actual tarmac, allows you to have a lot of grip when you're driving around in normal dry conditions. Well, when it rains, that layer of water fills those valleys up in those jagged peaks of the surface of the track, and prevents rubber from getting into them and contacting the surface. Water cannot compress, and instead it just stays there. And so a slick tire that has no ability to channel that water away through the grooves will just ultimately sit on top of the water and hydroplane. So that's in a nutshell why we use wet weather tires in wet conditions. And in complete rainout conditions, we have to go a further step to try to avoid standing water on track, even if we have rain tires. Now, that is the why we run rain tires. How do we run rain tires, or what's the best way to drive in the rain? Well, first off, the whole goal of wet weather racing is try to find grip. That's kind of the big mantra, is search the track out and try to find as much grip as possible so you can take corners as fast as possible. This means not driving necessarily on the racing line. The racing line has lots of races on it, hence the racing line, and lots of cars drive on it, and that over time those cars lay a layer of rubber on the racing line as they drive around the track. This rubber becomes very slick, and as I talked about before, with a normal road surface with peaks and valleys, when there's a lot of rubber laydown on the racing line, those peaks and valleys become less and less. Instead, they're filled already with old tire compound and old rubber compound in those peaks and valleys. Rain rains, there's even less peaks and valleys, less contact with the surface of the road, therefore more slick. So by the rule of thumb is, when it's wet outside, the racing line becomes incredibly slick, as well as though it was covered in water, and it's easier to hydroplane. So we need to seek the areas of the track that have more grip, and that allow us to take the corners as fast as possible. And this is off the racing line. The difficult part about that, though, is that the racing line zigs and zags across the track as we go through it. And so when entering a regular corner, if we are going to drive a rain line, we may displace the apex or we may break offline. But at some point in that corner, we're typically going to cross the racing line twice. We're going to cross it on entry, and then we're going to cross it on exit. Obviously, not all corners are the same, and some corners are vastly different, and you may end up crossing more than 2 times depending on the complex of corners you're going through. But in general, if we take a 90-degree corner, you're going to end up crossing the racing line twice. So in order for us to give the car the best chance to navigate that type of corner where it's crossing the racing line a couple of times, where it's crossing areas where there's less grip, when we cross those areas, we need to be sure that we're not asking too much of the tire. So if we think back to our traction circle, where the traction circle is the maximum amount of grip that a car has at any given time, when we are cornering in the middle of a corner, we're asking the tires to give us all of its grip and lateral grip so it can actually go around the corner. Well, when we hit that racing line, all of a sudden that lateral grip that we may have may shrink drastically. It may go down to a third of what it was before. In order to combat that, the best thing that we can do is we can try to put the car in a condition where it is able to grip up in those scenarios. So crossing the racing line with relatively straight tires will help give the car more room to have grip over those low grip areas, if that makes sense. Another thing is to make sure that we're not going at them at fast speed when we cross the racing line. We've slowed the car down enough, given us enough headroom on the traction circle, so that when the traction circle shrinks when we cross the racing line, the tires aren't just going to give up and we're not just going to understeer or oversteer off the track. Things you have to think about. The other thing that you also have to think about when you're considering a racing line is it's a bit of a balance game. It depends on how wet the surface is, how much rain is falling, and how much grip is on the track. Remember, wet weather tires are designed to drive in the wet. So they're designed to push water out of the way so the tire can grip the surface of the road. We want to allow them to do their job, which means that there sometimes are lines that allow us to take some more of a racing line approach to corners, because that is the fastest way around the track. Typically, the racing line will apex close to where the true apex of the corner is. And a wet line will displace that apex. Wet lines tend to travel further. You tend to go further and cover more area or more ground on a pure wet line. However, the track may not be so wet as to give you the benefits of driving on a full wet line. You may be able to get away with driving on maybe closer racing line, even in wet conditions on wet tires. It just depends on the surface of the track. The other thing to finally think about on here is when driving on the racing line with wet tires, do you have to slow down so much to stay on that line to where it would have been faster going a longer distance on a wet line? So these are all things to consider. If it stops raining while you're driving, you may actually end up having situations where the wet line is becoming too dry for the wet tires and the tires are heating up too much and you are losing grip as a result of that. Wet weather tires like to have a certain temperature range they stay in, and if they're driven on a dry surface for extended periods of time, they will wear prematurely and they will overheat, and you will overall lose even more grip than if you were on dry tires in that scenario. So lots of things to consider in general. And to summarize this kind of brief intro, when driving in the wet, you want to make sure you're seeking out areas of grip where it is drier and has the most grip relative to the tire combo that you're using. But you also want to consider that you don't want to drive so much on the wet line that you're leaving time on the table because you're traveling further distance around the track. So with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at Brands Hatch, an example of a lap here at Brands Hatch in the 992 Cup in wet conditions, and kind of get an idea of what I consider maybe the racing line in these conditions, and where I was finding grip and success. So let's go to the chase cam here, and we'll start the lap. So coming up to turn one at Brands Hatch is a iconic turn. We have this big, large uphill section that forces us to brake kind of in a straight line towards the outside of the track, and then take a nice sweeping right-hander that is on camber initially, and then as it goes down the hill on the exit of the corner, the camber disappears, gravity is hurting us, and the car likes to try to understeer to the outside of the corner. So the goal is an extremely late apex traditionally, over the corner, over the hill, down into the valley on the exit. The racing line, or the wet racing line, is very similar to the dry racing line in the sense that we're taking kind of the same approach to it. And the reason we take it is because any other line is going to be way slower than the traditional racing line. In practice around Brands Hatch, your braking zones are going to be offset from where you would normally brake in the dry. And so this is an example of one of them. So typically you may see people driving into Brands Hatch on the left side of the road, braking up the hill over here on the left, and then taking a nice wide arc in. I'm going to brake on a shallower line, so I'm offline from that traditional line, because that's where there's more grip, because there's less rubber laid down in the wet. So I am braking kind of mid-track, but my car is still angled out to the outside. I'm braking just before the 150 board, downshifting down, and I'll go all the way down to, I believe, third gear through here. Once I get to about the 50 board, I'm going to start tucking the car in, and I'm going to try to basically a little bit of trail brake on my initial turn in, and then kind of get off the pedals with the idea of, after I've rotated the car, start feeding on throttle to accelerate down the hill. You can see right here on my turn-in point, I'm pretty much almost off the pedals, just a little bit of trail braking, and then after I've tucked the car in, I am looking basically where the apex curbing and the hill is cresting. So the edge of my vision, that's where I want to apex it, and I'm going to try to drive my car so my front tires are just clipping that inside there. You'll also notice when you're looking, especially in the rain, and as it starts to rain heavier at Brands Hatch, there is a puddle here on the inside. However, we're hitting that with our unloaded tires, so it's not too much of a concern. If our loaded tires were hitting that puddle, like on the back side of this corner, as we'll see in a second, the concern is hydroplaning on loaded tires can cause traction issues. But in this case, it's pretty much a traditional line through here. There's my apex point right here, pretty close to the curb, kind of through this little bit of standing water with the unloaded tires. You'll notice that when you hit that, the car will understeer a little bit, but the angle, if you take it late enough, if you take a late enough apex through there, the angle is such that you can get a good run coming down the hill. When we go back to full throttle, I try to feel like the car is pointed down mid-track, and if I do that, then the car will naturally understeer over more towards the racing line. But I'm allowing a little bit room on the outside because of the aforementioned puddle on the exit here. This huge dark spot, and you can actually see the reflection, is a huge spit of standing water that tends to form pretty quickly at Brands Hatch. We don't want to go through this. If you do go through this, you'll notice that as soon as you touch it, the car will just basically go to the left, and then you're basically trying to just control the car through the gravel, and it's very slow. So left side tires can basically kiss it right around here about mid-track, but we don't want to go 4 tires over it. So as I come through, there's the kiss of the puddle right here on the way out. So I'm basically pinching the exit. I'm not tracking out to where I normally would, which would be all the way out to the curbing and over the curbing in a dry scenario, because of this pedal that's here. My steering is pretty much straight on the compression on the way down, and I can be full throttle in third gear all the way up to Druids, which is turn 2. Druids is one of the few corners on the track where it seems like braking on the racing line isn't that big a deal. I think what's happening is because we're going uphill, it's helping give traction to the car. And for some reason, there's probably a lot of different varying lines going into Druids, especially when people are racing. So the amount of rubber is spread evenly across the track, and it's not concentrated just on one line. So I tend to take more of a traditional braking zone coming into Druids. I'm braking well before the 50 board. Normally you'd brake around the 50 board on the way in, but because it's wet, we're braking well before it. So about maybe the 75 board, basically when the transition of the track is from the sand to the grass. everywhere when it's wet outside, you're going to brake earlier, you're going to brake softer. You can't use as much brake because there's just not as much grip. Your traction circle is dramatically shrunk in the rain, as we discussed before. The idea with Druids and this very, very long right-hander is as we get to the tabletop at the top of Druids for the turn-in point, the track flattens out. There is some camber in it that is helping us, and while we want to use that in the dry, in the wet, gravity pulls water downhill, and so where the water tends to pool is at the bottom of the camber. So when we have turns that give us camber, like a little bit on Druids and other places around the track, unfortunately the apex of the corner on the traditional line is where the water pools, and we want to avoid. Druids no exception. So my thought process here is drive it in deep. If we're driving it in deep, we're going to take more of a traditional rain line. So the most amount of grip in the wet is around the shoulder and the outside of this corner. But understanding that if you drive all the way around the outside of this corner, you're going to travel a significantly longer distance than if you came in and apexed on the dry line. So we need to find the balance of how much grip we can have in the car without having to drive all the way around the shoulder. So what I try to do in the rain is I'll try to drive it in. We'll cross the dry line on our way in. So this is the first crossing of the dry line, pretty much right where my car is. So I'll have a little bit less grip right here. And the goal is to drive the car deep, diamond it about halfway through the corner. So basically stop it, rotate it, and then drive out. So it's very angular. And then I'll cross the dry racing line once more on exit, but the car will be going straight when it crosses it. So I've turned in just a little bit. I've gone a little bit deep into here where normally I would be over here if this was a dry race. I'm driving it deeper to where the grip is. I get to about halfway through here. I don't have any work on the pedals, so I'm just kind of coasting the car around, letting the car rotate and scrub speed through the steering angle. And then as I over rotate the car and it starts to tuck back in, start feeding on throttle to get an acceleration out. When I cross the second rain or dry line, which would be somewhere in this area, my steering is almost straight. I'm getting to full throttle through there, and I'm getting a nice good run coming out of the corner. So to show what that looks like without starting and stopping it, coming up into Druids, brake in a straight line, longer, softer brake than we would in the dry. Take it nice and deep to where the grip is, get off the pedals, allow all the grip in the tires to give us lateral grip for the turn, back on throttle when the car starts to rotate, and then straightening out the wheel as we can without getting too far to the inside. Turn 3, I believe this is turn 3 or turn 4, coming down after Druids, is a very tricky corner in the wet. It is very easy to go too deep into this corner and then get all messed up. On the traditional racing line, the brake zone is over here on the right side of the track. Around the 50 board is where you would brake to set yourself up. If you allow yourself to get that deep in there, there will be no grip on the track because that's where everybody is braking. Instead, the goal for me here is to try to bring it in shallower, drive more along this line that I'm showing with my cursor. Brake in a straight line down here, let the car drift a little bit towards the outside before final turn in. This corner is awkward. It feels like you can't slow down enough for this corner on turn in the wet. When you finally get to the turn in point, you're crossing the rain line or the dry line, and you're going to lose front end grip. So the car really wants to understeer. And then once you cross that point on the way out, the rear of the car starts to get slippy and it wants to oversteer. So it's kind of doing everything at once. My thought process here is a brake zone. Again, I start braking way back here. So I am on the brakes here way early, and I'm trying to brake in a straight line off the racing line in order to give myself the most amount of grip to slow the car down. As we go into here and we finally get to a point where we're slow enough to where we have enough grip in the car still for the turn in, we'll start to tuck the car in second gear. Now through here, it's kind of just searching for grip. I've tried driving around the outside where there is more grip, but you're going so much of a further distance and running the risk of running and touching the grass. I find that this like middle hybrid line with these conditions was working out best for me to carry out the speed, but there is a huge puddle on the inside that we do not want to drive over. So about mid-track through here, pretending that there's maybe a car width of no-go zone on the inside, We have to be patient, wait, wait, wait. And then when we go to throttle right here, we're crossing the dry line on our way out, and the car is going to have very little grip. And in fact, on this particular lap, you can see I get some oversteer that I have to correct for. In the rain, you got to get comfortable with the car kind of sliding around. If you're not sliding around, you're not on the edge of grip and you're not necessarily going fast. So a little bit of corrections and oversteers are necessary for you to find out where the grip is. I wish I could say that I'm perfect or anybody's perfect, that they can drive around kind of like in a dry race and never have any oversteer and just be on the edge of grip every time. But frankly, that's almost impossible to do. The only way you're going to know where grip is when you start exceeding that grip limit, and then you'll know how much grip there was when you went through it. And every lap will be different depending on the weather conditions. So if the rain slows down or stops, next time you go through that corner, you may have more grip than the previous time and you may not slide as much, which means you could go faster. Finding that edge of grip with the car moving around is the only way that you can get to that edge reliably and use it to go faster and faster. So if we go back and show this without me stopping it again, coming into turn 3, turn 4, brake in a straight line down the hill, get the car slowed down enough, tuck it in, roll the speed through the corner without touching the pedals, and then start accelerating as you're opening your hands, ready to catch a slide. Don't touch the curbs anywhere around here. Painted surfaces and wet are incredibly slick, usually more slick than the track surface itself. So avoid the curbs as much as you can. If you do have to go over a curb, when you go over the curb, make sure your hands are relatively straight. You're not accelerating, you're not braking. You want all the grip to be in giving you lateral grip to survive touching the curb. So right here, I got right on it, but I didn't touch it, so I was okay. All right, coming up to turn 5, another very tricky corner on the track. Normally, the traditional line is way on the outside of the corner, taking a super late apex all the way around this very, very long sweeping left-hander. The wet line is going to be displaced off of that. So what I like to do is I like to brake shallower and treat it more like a double apex corner. So I'm going to brake on a line down in this direction off the racing line. Let the car run out to about mid-track, about mid-corner while trying to tuck it back in and get the car straightened out for a good solid run coming out of the corner. So it looks like this. Turning in, braking before the 50 mark, a little bit shallow here on the entry. At this point, getting close to the left side, I'm going to let the car rotate as much as I can through here and then get it turned and accelerate out coming out of it. A lot of that turn is on the racing line from the second to latter half, and you just can't help it. Just that's the way the line of the way the track is kind of designed. Coming down the straightaway, you'll notice there are some puddles that you need to kind of be aware of, especially if you're racing somebody. You can see them right here. There's puddles on the inside, and then there's a couple big puddles in the middle of the track. Just be ready for them. If you go over them, your car may jerk one way or the other because of hydroplaning. Just don't panic if the car starts to move around like that. It's just racing in the wet. All right, coming into, I guess this is turn 6, the very fast right-hander. On the racing line, we would be all the way on track left, allowing ourselves to have a nice big open entry into a fast right-hand sweeper in 4th gear. In the rain, it's not that. We want to brake offline, so mid-track or even further right than mid-track if it gets any wetter than it currently is. Because if we brake online, we're going to lock all our tires. And in fact, I believe on this particular lap, I actually did lock a tire, but I had enough room to be able to release it and get my grip back. So even braking offline like this before the 100 board, so about, I want to say, I start touching it actually at the 150 mark. Right here, I locked up a little bit. So braking offline, nice smooth brake, nice long brake. And the key is just stay smooth. We'll cross. I'm turning in actually a little bit early because the racing line is somewhere around here. So I'm trying to get my first initial turn in before I actually cross the racing line on this particular corner. But once I get to about here, I'm on the racing line. And at this point, it's just managing the grip where it exists. It will push me out and understeer me a little bit. But once I come off the racing line through, my grip will come back. I'll be able to finish my rotation of the car and accelerate down the corner. I do get up on the curb a little bit, and you can see how slippery it is just by touching it. Your other option, if you take a true race or a true wet line through here, would be to go deep and drive around the outside of the corner. The only problem is you're going to be traveling a lot further, and you run the risk of, if you go too hot, you're going to run out of room and go into the grass and probably hit the wall as a result. So this is one of those where it's just, there's not really many options in terms of how you can take this corner in the wet. You're going to be on the dry line for a portion of it. You just have to accommodate. Coming into the first set of double right-handers through, oh, and I'm in third gear through there on the way out. Coming through this first set, or the first of the double right-handers, I tend to brake early and soft on the racing line to kind of open the corner. And based on what I can see from where the grip, I take this corner pretty much online. Obviously, it's slower than it would be in the dry, but my goal here is to get up on the right side curbing like I would in the dry. This is the unloaded side of the car, but taking it out here on a traditional wet line is just too slow. You don't get the advantage of this corner is kind of like a kink. And so you get it tucked in a little bit and then you accelerate through the corner. It's the same in the wet. Any other alternative is just way too slow. We touch that curb. We don't want to run too wide through here, because if we do, and we touch this curbing, we're going to end up out here in the grass. Second, third gear, depends on the conditions. And I think on these laps, I was going down to second. If it's a little bit drier and there's more grip and you can carry more speed, you can definitely carry it in third gear. Coming down the hill, for the next right-hander at the top of the hill, my goal is to basically create a straight line between the 100 board and the edge of the track. So a very, very shallow brake zone that's probably slightly offline. There's a lot of lines in the dry through here, so there's still a lot of grip on the braking zone. So I'm braking at the 100 board, braking in a straight line, getting the car turned as I start to crest the hill. Try to get down to this curb, just much like the previous right-hander. On this particular lap, I didn't quite get there, but that's okay. And then start picking up speed when I get to the grippy part, which will be out here again, right on the edge of the track. Careful not to dip a wheel on the exit. This left-hander is a very traditional left-hander. Even in the wet, I was finding a lot of grip in the braking zone here, and then the turn-in was very much like it is on the dry. There's no standing water. It looks like all the water is running off this highly cambered corner and is down here on the curbing. So we don't want to touch the curbing, but we can get down here. The camber is helping keep that water off the track. And I was in second gear through there. The most difficult braking zone, in my opinion, is this final corner, right-hander. We don't want to be anywhere near the traditional racing line. Everything here is slick as ice. Just touching the brake or even thinking of the brake coming in here on the left side of the track is going to lock your wheels. So extreme right hand, even further right than you think. We're going to brake before the 100 board, so pretty much at the bridge here. And then as we brake and we start to bleed off speed, we can start moving the car over to the left to open up the right-hander. We're going to get the car kind of rotated very early, so we're kind of like pitching the car in and pitching the back end of the car out to get that rotation, to kind of try to slide the car and get that rotation that we need. Traditional apex, but keeping it much tighter than we would on the dry line, because the dry line is going to open out and we want to keep it nice and tight where there's grip. And on the back side of this corner, it seems like the car wants to understeer everywhere, so we can use that to our advantage. Point the nose a little further right, jump on that throttle early. The car's behavior through here is understeer, so it'll just kind of push and you'll be right on line on the way out. We don't want to drift out too far to the left because that's the racing line and there's less grip. And then coming across start-finish line, just keep it nice and tight. That's the shortest distance that we can travel, and then we'll go for another lap at Brands Hatch. So if I back it up to the start again, we'll take it from the cockpit so you can kind of see what it looks like. So coming into turn one, like I said, nice and shallow, brake toward the outside. Get off the brakes after you've turned it in. Feet on the throttle once you realize you're going to keep it about mid-track. Brake in a straight line on the left side. We're going to go a little bit deep. Idea is to rotate the car here, over-rotate it, and then get back on throttle. We're going to brake, keep the car left, slow it down, second gear, and then we're just looking for grip. Waiting, looking for grip, playing with the throttle, catching the oversteer. We're going to brake after the 100 board shallow, kind of like a double apex. So there would be kind of apex 1 here. And then we're just waiting for the car to get its rotation done and then back on throttle. Checking our mirrors, checking our gauges. Coming up to the fast sweeper, we're going to brake offline about somewhere mid-track. Tuck it in early where there would be some grip. Down to 3rd gear. And then once the car finally rotates, back on throttle. Just have to be patient with it. Traditional line here, 3rd gear, tuck it in, down to 2nd gear, accelerate out, stay away from the left side of the track where there's on the racing line. Brake between the 100 board and the edge of the track, tuck it in, wait for the grip to come, there it is, and then add throttle. Traditional racing line here, don't touch the curbing on the inside, but get down to it, and then accelerate out. And then in the final corner, keep way to the right for the initial brake zone, but fade to the left before entry. Get the car rotated early, and then power out of it and let the understeer keep the car nice and stable. And there you go. That's a lap of Brands Hatch in a very, very wet conditions. So for this one, for those keeping track at home, track is moderately wet, so I'd say about normal rain. And obviously the track temp is incredibly cold because of the rain. It's tough. I'm not going to say that this is an easy track to drive in the wet. It is incredibly difficult, frankly. But practice makes perfect. Practice helps you know where the grip is. And the reason I spent so much time at the beginning of this video trying to talk about the theory of what we're trying to think of is when we race in the rain is because racing in the rain is not like racing in the dry where the grip is kind of pretty much consistent. When you race in the dry, especially in sim, you can turn so many laps that you know if you brake at X board, turn in at X spot, apex at Y, and track out to Z, you can do that every single time. The grip's going to be very similar. In the rain, you throw that all out the window because the variance of grip across lap after lap is going to be significant. And some laps you may have no grip. If the track dries, you may have more grip. And you have to adapt to that. So you have to have a methodology and an idea of how you want to drive in the wet in order to go quickly. You know you need to find where the grip is. You know that the grip may be changing. So you have to have a plan of how am I going to take corners in order to account for a varying amount of grip at any given moment. And then once you get to that idea and you practice that methodology, when you go out and you race or when you go out and you hot lap, you can use that methodology on the fly to improvise and be adaptable to the changing conditions. So the best drivers in the rain are the ones that can adapt and, can vary their plan based on what they're feeling in the car. The folks that struggle in the rain are the ones that require everything to be absolutely precise and familiar. You don't know how much grip is going to be in a specific corner in changing conditions. And so hopefully this will make you a better driver racing in the rain. If you are struggling with it, don't get discouraged. Understand that other people are struggling as well. I think the people that are going to do well this week or these next 2 weeks for round 2 are going to be those that don't get frustrated, keep the car on the tarmac and finish without having incidents. You don't necessarily have to go set fastest laps in these conditions. Frankly, you just need to keep the car on track for an hour and let other people make mistakes, and you will finish relatively well to the field. So I wish you guys the best of luck. I will see you guys next week. I will be racing in the pro race on Wednesday night. If you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to message me on Discord, and I'll be happy to try to help out as best I can. But good luck, and I'm sure you guys are going to do fantastic in the next race at Brands Hatch. Thank you so much.